Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Executive Director William Wolfe, and this is the SBC Weekly Roundup Countdown to Orlando. We have been overwhelmed by the positive support and feedback from our first two editions of what we hope will be more or less a weekly entry in our Center for Baptist Leadership podcast lineup and resource offerings as we head towards Orlando. So thank you for those who have tuned in to our first two editions of this. You can find those on our YouTube at Center for Baptist Leadership. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. I think we're even on Rumble, though I honestly never look at that, but I'm pretty sure we're there. And interestingly enough, YouTube was removing views. Jon Whitehead is so controversial and spicy in his commentary that YouTube decided it was dangerous and not only froze the view count of our second episode, but then was proactively removing them. But it was still, the second one in particular was incredibly well viewed on X, but we want to reach people on those other platforms as well. So tune into our previous two episodes, share them with your pastor friends, share them with your local associations, because really what we're doing in these conversations is something that you're just not going to get anywhere else. Jonathan Howe is not going to be having the conversations that me and Jon Whitehead are having. The Baptist Review are not going to be having the conversations that Jon Whitehead and I are having. And so if you want to get the SBC news and why it matters for Orlando, make sure to tune into this weekly roundup on the countdown to Orlando. So like we did last time, I'm going to cover some headlines here for us, and then we'll bring in Jon Whitehead for commentary. As many of you guys will have known, last week, the executive committee met for its February meeting, and they approved a cooperative program budget of $168 million, as well as helping the International Missions Board reach the historic 51% allotment that was promised to them from the Great Commission Resurgence Task Force. And so they will receive 51% of all CP gifts going forward, fulfilling that 2010 goal. And the executive committee is taking the single largest proportional cut of any entity within the Southern Baptist Convention, dropping from a 2.99% allotment to 2.65% allotment. So that goes to show that the executive committee will continue to have budgetary issues. We've talked about the reasons behind many of those. But also this $186 million number that they've approved and will be bringing to Southern Baptists in Orlando is down from $190 million from previous years. So we are continuing to trend downward. So that's the current sort of budget state of the executive committee. Dr. Jeff Orge and our president, Clint Presley, both gave addresses to the gathered members of the executive committee. And I will say that it was interesting to note, and I'll talk about this with Jon Whitehead, the pretty marked departure and change of tone from SBC Executive Committee CEO and President Jeff Orge. Last fall, as many of you will remember at the September meeting, he essentially berated many Southern Baptist Convention churches and pastors for being so-called, quote, expressive individualists because of the way that churches are continuing to designate giving around the general cooperative program allotment because of declining trust and confidence in how the cooperative program is being stewarded. But 6 months later, nothing was said about that. This time, we were treated to a little bit of the SBC's version of the Lego movie in which everything was awesome. And we heard that from Dr. Jeff Orge, and I would say somewhat similar from Clint Presley. Clint Presley mentioned that we don't always agree as Southern Baptists. He says we don't overlook our problems. I'm not sure if that's always the case, but we can talk with Jon about that too. But that he doesn't always agree with Dr. Jeff Orge, which I appreciate those comments in his remarks as well. But they're, moving forward on mission together. So Jon and I will dive into what happened in the executive committee a little bit more. But next, also noteworthy at the meeting, they disfellowshipped 2 more churches over female pastors. The egalitarian issue is not going away. And unfortunately, it was only 2 and not 200, because we have dozens of more churches that have female pastors, but at least it was 2. But those who are fighting for reform should not be complacent. We disfellowshipped the Crossing Church in Tampa, Florida, where Tamara Dumas co-pastors were with her husband, and Zion Temple Baptist Church in O'Fallon, Illinois, where Marcia Blake serves as the lead pastor. So the thing that we've all been told isn't happening in the Southern Baptist Convention, lead female pastors, is in fact happening. And I guess we're taking care of some of them, but certainly not all of them. This was a recommendation from the Credentials Committee, and it continues to be an enforcement of the 2023 change to the Baptist Faith and Message on pastoral qualifications, but still absent the law amendment. There is a lot of work left to do on the female pastor front. Moving on to broader Southern Baptist Convention news, at the start of this week, we learned that the Supreme Court of the United States did deny cert in McRaney versus NAMB, officially ending what's now been an 8-year lawsuit. They declined to hear Will McRaney's case against NAMB, bringing a close to this 8-year legal battle. The Fifth Circuit Court had dismissed his claims under the so-called church autonomy doctrine, and so McRaney had appealed that to the Supreme Court, but they did not hear it. NAMB, as projected by many individuals, including Jon Whitehead, championed it as a landmark protection for religious liberties, but more astute and informed critics will note and warn that this ruling gives SBC entity leaders broad legal cover now to make false and defamatory statements about ministers and church partners within the Southern Baptist Convention with no legal recourse, which is incredibly concerning and is not something that should be being celebrated. And if you see people celebrating it, you should ask some follow-up questions. Additionally, in terms of the race for the next presidential candidate, the next president of the SBC, it's still a 2-man race between Josh Powell from South Carolina and Willie Rice from Florida. Nobody else has entered into that race yet. However, the recording secretary of the Southern Baptist Convention has multiple candidates after Nathan Finn announced that he would not seek a 5th term as SBC recording secretary, citing the optics of 2 officers from the same church because he is at Powell's church at Taylor's First Baptist. We now have seen 3 candidates who will be nominated for that open seat: Jonathan Greer from Mississippi, Travis Kearns, also from South Carolina, and George Schroeder from Texas. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is still searching for its next full-time president. They've narrowed the search down to 8 candidates, and the March trustee meeting for the ERLC will be the next milestone. I will also mention that the ERLC had another Racial Reconciliation Sunday recently, and they released a podcast between Pastor Fred Luter and the interim president there at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Gary Hollingsworth. Might be worth a listen for people in the Southern Baptist Convention who are curious as to what we are doing vis-a-vis conversations on race relations and so-called racial justice and racial reconciliation in the SBC, even as our culture and our president and most of the conservative evangelicals across America are trying to leave woke behind. Also of note at the executive committee meeting was the fact that they had to remove a committee member from the Committee on Nominations, Emily Wise of West Virginia, after she was arrested in January on charges of sexual abuse of a minor. This is probably the most high-profile removal by the executive committee of an individual within the Southern Baptist Convention orbit who's been accused of sexual abuse of a minor. And so that is obviously tragic. Please be praying for their church. But it's just an interesting note here in what's going on with the continued efforts to enact abuse reform in the Southern Baptist Convention. So those are sort of our top topics of the week here. And bringing up now, we'll have Jon Whitehead, our commentator. Jon, thanks for coming back for a 3rd round here.
Hey, William, good to be here.
All right, Jon, let's do executive committee meeting first. What was your takeaway from seeing the reports, from seeing the numbers, the conversation there? Where do things stand?
Yeah, not much news. I think I was probably surprised by the absence of some news. As we've talked about in prior episodes, there had been some scuttlebutt about perhaps a resignation or turnover at the head there. That we didn't hear any news about that. There'd also been a call to do away with the ERLC or amend its ministry assignment. They the executive committee rejected a call to change the ministry assignment, although it wasn't a change at all, as we pointed out last year. I'm not sure that did anything, but there was no effort to rein in the RLC or change its ministry assignment or do away with it, despite those discussions happening. So the fact those didn't show up probably registered in my mind as fairly significant. In terms of the news that was made, I think the big news will be obviously the shift to 51% to foreign missions. A lot of folks have asked for that over the years, and that is a historic milestone at the cost, mostly the cost of reducing the executive committee's allocation. And so query, given what's happened the last 2 years, we've been told the executive committee cannot function with its current allocation. This year, for whatever reason, they've decided they can do with less, but they still have ongoing legal pressures and a fairly broad assignment that probably is underfunded in some ways. So what changed there is, as you said in the lead-in, it does seem we went backwards from we've got real concerns and things are going wrong with the Cooperative Program to back to everything is awesome. And so this was mostly an everything is awesome meeting.
John, actually, let me drill down on that too. And also, if you caught any updates on the legal cases, because I'm not sure if I did, if they gave an update on Garner or Hunt or any of those. It is a very marked departure from what has been a year plus now conversation about significant budget shortfalls for the executive committee, things that have come up at their meetings and at our annual meetings. Do you think they're getting funding from somewhere else? Is there some source of funding for the executive committee that we don't know about that's meeting this budget shortfall behind the scenes?
Well, I mean, I don't know about this particular year. In the past, whenever the executive committee had a shortfall, they had turned to NAMB. NAMB, in some ways, is the convention's bank. I've heard that thrown around. And so I know, during Ronnie Floyd's tenure, there was a subsidy by NAMB of give or take $500,000 a year. That was what the report was. So in the past, when they've got significant overflow or expenditures they can't meet, they've turned to other SBC entities. And in the old business financial plan, the rule just was the executive committee had to approve interagency transfers, and so they approved their own. So does that mean going forward, NAMB does more or less support of the executive committee? I don't know. It's just, again, interesting. There was not enough budget last year. And this year, again, they say there's not enough budget. And yet the consensus is they're going to cut their CP allocation in the face of overall declining Cooperative Program. We've not met that budget in the last few years. So, the funding of the executive committee and its role in the convention will continue to be a matter of debate.
And why do you think the tone has changed so drastically? I mean, because it really was the reaction to the September meeting was pretty monumental. I mean, that's where, I had pastors kind of coming out of the woodworks, contacting me, contacting Center for Baptist Leadership, saying, what is going on here? I've never felt more insulted. I've never been more frustrated with what I'm hearing from the executive committee. We've made these changes and are giving allocations because we don't trust what's going on. The designated giving has not come down. That's not really changed significantly in any way. And yet it's as if we moved past the September meeting like it never happened. What's your read on why we got this different tone and posture?
Well, likely they heard back that approach was not going to grow the Cooperative Program. The approach of its expressive individualism that's leading to declines, that's probably was put back to them in the meetings they have with churches. And we talked about a off the record meeting with churches about the future of the CP. And my guess is the message came back loud and clear. That's not going to sell. And so perhaps maybe that's what sparks The survey we did see out of this week, the survey that Dr. Orrs reported on from Lifeway Research and kind of in-house research study, asking various questions about the cooperative program. And of course, you're able to, in that data, find slides that say everything is awesome. You're also able to find some pretty significant weaknesses in the cooperative program. And so I think probably the answer to the question is that dog wasn't going to hunt about expressive individualism. There needs to be a better story than that. And so maybe the survey represents some attempt to come back and look at data and say, well, what do people really think about where we are and what message are we going to have going forward? And so we've reverted to old habits, frankly, about everything is awesome. That's the fallback when you don't know what else to say.
Yeah. So I've pulled up some of these slides. There are many slides, these bright primary colored pie charts about the cooperative program. So some of them are interesting. If I'm running the cooperative program, if I'm running the executive committee, I'm probably pretty pleased with these results. Does the cooperative program help churches accomplish more together than they could alone? 57.3% strongly agree, 33.9%, agree. So you're getting close to like 90% agree, which I would hope that would be the case, because this is the fundamental thesis of the entire Southern Baptist Convention, is that we accomplish more together than we do alone. So it's not so much that thesis is in contention, it's the how we are cooperating and what we are cooperating on. Decline in cooperative program participation would hurt missions and ministry effectiveness. I mean, John, I think you and I would agree with that. We would say, strongly agree. Yep. Most people strongly agree. Have you personally seen positive results from ministries funded through the cooperative program? Pretty high respondent rate there, 43.7% strongly agree, 36.8% agree. So they're still in the 80s. Where things kind of start to slip a little bit is when we get maybe just a tad bit more granular here. The cooperative program promotes unity among Southern Baptists. Here we only have a 41% strongly agree. We also have a 41% agree. So we've got an 82% agreement, but if we kind of round the numbers up, that means we have and you flip the script here, we have 1 in 5 saying it does not promote unity among Southern Baptists. But then, even a lower respondent rate here, and this really gets into designated giving. The cooperative program is our church's preferred method of missions giving. And here we come all the way down to 31.6% strongly agree, 41.7% agree. Okay, so, we're looking at a little over 70% there, almost 72% there. But that means that, 3 out of 10 Southern Baptists are saying it's not their church's preferred method of mission giving. And this really starts to kind of, I think, show some of the cracks in the cooperative program. Go ahead, John.
And so cross-check that with reality. If 70% say the cooperative program is our preferred method, but only 48% of the dollars come in through the cooperative program, that tells you there's about 20% of folks that are a little bit happier. They're answering the survey questions a little more optimistically than what their churches are actually doing. So yes, independently, that's a great number. But when you cross-check it against what people actually do, there's a decreasing number of folks that actually send that next dollar through the cooperative program. And that's the kind of concern we've been raising.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the dollars are a more reliable survey than anything Lifeway could ever produce.
Right.
And then this one, too, I thought was interesting in terms of like sort of decreasing trust, where it says my church views the cooperative program as a trustworthy way to support missions. And, and there we're again, well, I mean, this is getting close to 90% again. So that's pretty strong. I think there was another one there. Okay, it was this one. My church has reduced cooperative program giving due to a lack of confidence in the SBC. And there we are at over 25%. Essentially saying, yes, my church has. So 46% disagree, 27% strongly disagree, but 7.2 and 7.8 and 11.4 are in the, we're not really going to say that that's not the case bucket here. So that's 1 out of 4. That's 1 out of 4 Baptists. And you're, of course, cross-check it with the reality is it's more than 1 out of 4. It's kind of closer to 1 out of 2.
Yeah. And again, remember the statistic we said last week. that since 2010, there has been roughly a 600% increase in designated giving to the missions entities. So, and so you say, well, how does that square with this slide? Well, inflation means churches can keep the same number, but it's not keeping up with the pace of their increase of giving. It's not keeping up with the purchasing power of inflation. So, you could have churches that give the same amount year over year, but if you don't increase with inflation, as hopefully our churches are growing, then the demonstrated confidence in the cooperative program seems to be falling behind.
Right. And it's interesting, too, that the International Missions Board is no doubt probably one of the biggest beneficiaries of a new regime of designated giving, who in an age of declining trust in the cooperative program and the general Southern Baptist Convention leadership, what do you care about the most? Who do you trust the most? Do you care about sending missionaries most? You probably still trust NAMB the most. So interesting that they are certainly the beneficiaries of the designated giving increases, and also getting up to the 51% allocation from the cooperative program, which across the board to me just seems to indicate that the pie for the rest of the SBC convention operations is going to get smaller and smaller.
Yeah, I think that certainly is the topic of the post-CP world meetings that we know leaders have been having, is what really drives this thing. And if it is, in fact, just missions giving and not really Baptist cooperation on other items, then you can imagine the arguments, right? Why are we doing any of this if that's not what unites us? I think that's not been tradition of the Baptist system. The Baptist system has been, we're going to agree on a budget for our churches together. We're going to ask the churches to cooperate together in funding, and then give them also the opportunity to set the budget. But those are two separate things. Whereas we seem to be going back to societal missions giving, where each church decides what it's going to send to individual entities. And if the old spirit fails, then yeah, we are going to go back to a world in which church is set by the entity, not by a cooperative program budget. And ultimately, I think that will be a loss to some really important things. There are some things we do together that shouldn't be our main focus, but that are really, really important, and that we do accomplish better together than we would apart. Things like seminary education, things like undergraduate education in the States, things like ministry to elderly and to people that are in foster care. So there are things that maybe aren't the focus, but I would hate to see those things collapse as churches give up on the idea of a budget that represents them and their priorities.
Yeah. And so related to that, I want to circle back to something we talked about last week, because it's been confirmed and there's a little bit more texture that's been given to it in terms of major changes at major entities. And what do we do in a post-cooperative program future? Well, so Vance Pitman is moving around the NAMB Send Network org chart in a very interesting way, which if you listen to Center for Baptist Leadership podcast or follow us on Twitter, you knew that from us a week before you heard it from Baptist Press. John and I, we talked about this in our podcast that was released last Monday. And then on February 19th, Baptist Press has an article, Pitman moves to national mobilizer role with NAMB's Send Network. So, and then it says Vance Pitman has moved from serving as president of the North American Missions Board Send Network, which is a huge role, like top dog role in SBC life, to his new role as national mobilizer. NAMB trustees learned during their February 3rd meeting in San Diego. Interesting, it took multiple weeks to make it to the official organ there, kind of probably trying to figure out what the story is. And also interesting, just from what we know, is that this national mobilizer role isn't exactly how it was initially communicated in the letter that went out to the Send Network family. There, they used this phrase Send Ventures Initiative, which is not what they're communicating here. And then since our conversation, John, this is very interesting. So I'm going to try to repeat it here to the best of my memory. But many of us were asking, why is Vance changing roles? Well, after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, a major Send Network pastor partner, James Robertson, in New York had some very unfriendly comments about Charlie Kirk, inaccurate comments, false comments, essentially calling Charlie Kirk a racist, essentially taking the line of the secular left, the hateful individuals who say Charlie Kirk was just a racist podcaster, and coming pretty close to essentially blaming Charlie for bringing it on himself. So pretty abhorrent comments from James Robertson, black pastor in New York, sparked an outcry, from conservatives in the Southern Baptist Convention. Tom Buck did work on that, and so did others. And then eventually we learned that James was sort of removed from an upcoming Send Network retreat where he was going to be speaking at it on, preaching and coaching. And we got a statement from Kevin Ezell, a very rare statement on how they're handling things. Well, from insiders who have very reliable information on this, we were told that Vance Pitman was very displeased with the fact that there was any pushback on Robertson, that there was any correction made of his statements, and that Vance essentially told Kevin Ezell, if he goes, I go. And so whether that's the exact words or not, I'm pretty confident that that was at play behind the scenes. And the same sort of insider recounted to me that they've heard Vance talk in NAMB meetings where he's made it very clear that essentially they are far more committed to visual diversity than biblical fidelity at NAMB. So with all that additional information now, we see he's moving into this very nebulous national mobilizer role that will enable him to start a preaching and coaching consulting business, but still kind of be connected to Send Network. A lot of people just, I think, rightly say, man, this is weird. This doesn't seem right or normal what's going on here. John, what is your reaction to all of that?
So remember last week we talked a lot about incentives. What are the incentives inside ministry? And are those aligned with Southern Baptist churches? Is it aligned with what Southern Baptist churches want? And I think over the past 10 years, there have been some that have decided, I cannot find enough growth among Southern Baptists who believe like Southern Baptists to look like I'm a leader, to show that I'm growing things. And so at the end of the year, I got to show there's been growth to keep my job. And so how am I going to do that? And as Southern Baptists, as the churches, you hope, well, that's by finding or convincing or persuading other Christians that the way the Baptist Faith and Message talks about these things, that you believe like us. And so we grow by adding people that believe like us. One shortcut to showing growth without getting people convinced that who believe the Baptist Faith and Message is to reach out and expand the tent stakes and try to bring in people that don't believe like us, but through by hook or by crook, bring them into the fold. And that way I, at the end of the year, can show there's been growth. Do they believe like us? Well, let's not micromanage. Let's just praise the Lord for the good results that have been growth. And as we've discussed, we're not so concerned with numerical growth as we are with spiritual growth, with the application of the Baptist Faith Message in local churches. That's the goal of the churches. So one thing a trustee has to do is to make sure, look beneath the happy report results and go, I'm glad you're showing growth. How are we sure that the growth we're showing is not unchecked growth? There's a difference between healthy cells and cancer. Cancer grows unchecked. So how are we making sure that we've got healthy growth and not growth that's not beneficial to us over the long term? That is the appropriate question for trustees to ask and for for entity heads to act on. So that part of what we've heard so far, I'm glad somebody asked, hey, we've made this person a leader. They don't appear to agree with us on much. They don't appear to even be want to cooperate with us that much. They're willing to make these statements in a way that doesn't unify behind our core beliefs. So in one sense, great. If we've got leaders that feel so strongly that they can't accomplish growth in the SBC unless they can reach out to people that don't believe like us, then great. Show those folks the door. That's a great move. The odd part, though, then is, well, once you've made that decision that I've got somebody on staff that for whatever reason doesn't agree with our direction and they need to be moved out of their job as a key leader, It also seems to me the other job of the trustees is to make sure that Baptist money gets spent on Baptist priorities. And so now you've got a contract position that may or may not have to answer to Baptist priorities. It seems pretty clear that the initiatives, the mobilization, is to mobilize non-Baptist churches in whatever direction they want.
Yeah, let me read that paragraph here from the Baptist Press story, because the contracted thing is really like kind of key here. Like, it's just a 9-day difference between being a contracted employee of Send Network and actually being an employee of Send Network, right? And so this is what it says. It says, in his new contracted role as national mobilizer, he will continue encouraging and influencing pastors, planters, and ministry partners across North America while representing and advancing the vision of Send Network. This change allows Pitman to launch a preaching, coaching, and consulting ministry. There's a word, John, that's notoriously or notably absent from that paragraph. Do you know what the word is? Baptist,
yeah.
Southern Baptist. And it's just like, well, what are we doing, Gavin? I think this really matters to, I think, people are saying like, what is this position? And we don't know. It's like the George Washington SNL skit. Like, what is a national mobilizer? Nobody knows. What is Send Network doing to advance the mission of Southern Baptists, or are they just advancing the mission of Send Network? I mean, those seem to be real questions worth asking.
And the confusion you would not want to see develop is that maybe those that give to designated giving, that money doesn't have to go to Baptist causes. It's only the money that comes from the Cooperative Program. That's Baptist causes. But maybe if we got money from someplace else, we wouldn't have to spend that advancing the Baptist faith and message. I think that would be a fundamental error in understanding the governance of NAMB. NAMB, no matter where it gets its money, has to ensure that it's spending Baptist money to advance Baptist interests. And while I understand there can always be edge cases about who we cooperate with, I don't want to put down an absolute rule there. The majority, the purpose, the focus, the goal still has to be advancing the Baptist faith and message in churches. And so if you have staff positions or contract positions, 1099 or W-2, it doesn't matter from the perspective of the churches. We expect all the money to go to advance the Baptist faith and message and not to undermine us. And so if somebody says, well, I can't get my work done and accomplish the Baptist message, then it's great. You're no longer a W-2 employee. Then the question becomes, in what way do you justify the 1099 contract income as an advancement of Baptist interests? Or are you setting up some kind of conflict between my personal ministry and what the Baptists are paying me to do? All that requires trustee interaction. And if trustees aren't involved at that level, aren't having that discussion in their meetings, then that is a serious concern. Like you said, it's interesting. We're hearing now, several weeks after the meeting, there was no report that the trustees discussed this matter. We're told they heard about it at their meeting. It didn't make it into the initial BP report. Only after we bring it up does a Baptist Press article get released. And it doesn't show the trustees engaging in that decision. It says they heard about it from the leaders. And again, I think it's probably good for trustees at that point to be digging in. Fine, he's no longer our W-2 employee, but in what way does this mobilizer arrangement advance the SBC's interests, whether it's from designated money or not?
Yeah, well, thank you, John, for that thoughtful fiduciary breakdown. As to sort of the resident yokel in this conversation, I just like, what are these roles? Like, what are they doing? Like, it's not so complicated. We can see it in the New Testament. I just finished reading Philippians to my boys, which is very interesting, right? We read the last book we did was Jonah, then we just finished Philippians. Not quite as, interesting for them, but a lot of good lessons. And like the methodology for faithfully planting churches is not so confusing, right? It's like you gather believers, you establish your polity. As Baptists, we believe we have a specific polity, essentially prescribed in the New Testament for us. Elders, pastors, deacons, members. That church grows, Hopefully you're doing evangelism. People convert, join your church. It grows. You see another need. You send out some qualified elders, pastors to plant a new church. You help support that church until it becomes self-sustaining. And this is what Southern Baptists have partnered together to do, is that we would have Southern Baptist churches planting Southern Baptist churches. And instead, we have national mobilizers. We have this whole suite of executive vice presidents at NAMB. There's so many vice presidents at NAMB. And this article mentions Executive Vice President Travis Ogle, who will lead in close collaboration with Executive Director Noah Oldman and Tony Marita, who oversees planter development. Jose Abella, who leads Send Network's Hispanic Network, and Dean Folks, who serves as Send Network Regional Director. It's just like this massive management bureaucratic bloat over an organization that's just supposed to help Southern Baptist churches plant churches according to the New Testament prescription for planting churches. And I have to say too, this is why we've seen the rise of so many outside organizations, right? This is why there's 9 Marks. This is why there's reaching and teaching. This is why, and I've swum in those circles for years. There's profound dissatisfaction with how NAMB goes about the whole church planting and training thing. And it does seem odd, John. I don't know if you want to add any color commentary on that, but we can move on. It's just is this I feel like if we went back in time 100 years and read something like this to our Southern Baptist Convention forefathers, they would look at us like, we had just stepped off a spaceship. It doesn't compute, I think.
That is exactly the point I'd make. That as Mark Dever might say, our grandmother knew how to do church planting better than we do now. Not only was there more growth in the past, right? So we all seen the membership curve, the number of churches planted going down. We don't even know how many churches NAMB plants. But not only was it more biblically faithful in the past, not only did that more biblically faithful method it show more growth in the past, I do worry that a significant change of the Great Commission resurgence, we'll probably talk about that someday, in 2010, there was a change that was meant to make NAMB more nimble and to give it a little more independence. And I'm afraid what we actually did was made it more sclerotic. We made it less nimble. One of my favorite Missouri Baptist history factoids was that the Methodists and the Episcopalians, when Missouri was new territory after the Louisiana Purchase, they would complain every time they showed up in a town to plant a church, the Baptists were already there because the Baptists were nimble. They were entrepreneurial. They were out doing the thing. And so that is what grew Southern Baptist churches, was that entrepreneurial spirit, and the leading edge was out in the field, not back in the home office. And I worry that what we saw with GCR was the setting up of NAMB as a collection of experts, and nobody out in the field can move until they give the word. And that focus reverting back towards the home office as opposed to out in the field. And I understand people will, people can come down differently on that question. But I am worried that so many vice presidents, the decision making we're seeing represents a NAMB that is less nimble, and so our Southern Baptist cooperation is less nimble, and I do think we've done better at that in the past, and the numbers might prove that.
Yeah, well, we don't have to belabor this any longer for this conversation, but this is obviously a relevant Southern Baptist Convention news story that we broke here at Center for Baptist Leadership, and that Baptist Press followed up on with a February 19th article. Take a look at it. I would just say read it and see, does this sound like New Testament and Southern Baptist church planting language? I mean, maybe it does to you. It doesn't to me. And I know I'm often an oddball in Southern Baptist Convention life, but I think there's a lot of questions there. But that is not really sort of the most, what Vance, Pitman is or isn't doing is not necessarily the most pressing issue for Southern Baptists. So let's get into the legal cases. Last time we talked a little bit about the McRaney case, but then we spent a little bit more time on the Garner case, which is very morally shocking what's going on there. Make sure to go listen to this. But the McRaney case is top of the news docket this week in particular because the Supreme Court, unsurprisingly, I think, decided not to hear McRaney's appeal after the Fifth Circuit Court decision didn't go his way. So, John, let's dive into that. If you could, maybe give us first a little bit of just like the top bullet points, play-by-play summary of the case over the last 8 years, just like when it started, where it went, because McRaney did win one time, didn't he? And then, right. So give us a little bit of here's when it started. Here's where McRaney won. Here's where he lost. Here's where they appealed. Here's where he appealed, and how we got here today.
Yeah. So McRaney's core complaint is that in 2015, NAMB used what we call a participation agreement, a SPA, between the national NAMB and a state convention. Cooperative money flows to NAMB, and then NAMB uses that in cooperation with states. It's supposed to advance the mission in those states, consistent with not only NAMB's view but the local church view. And so the complaint, apparently by NAMB, was McRaney was not willing to do everything NAMB wanted, and so NAMB came to the state convention and said, "If you don't fire McRaney, we're going to pull all of our funding," and that would be that would implode the state convention. They couldn't function if they didn't have that outside money from NAMB. So the convention fired NAMB or fired McRaney. And then McRaney says NAMB officers, leaders, then proceeded to call other Southern Baptist churches and try to make sure McRaney couldn't get a job, couldn't get speaking engagements. And in the middle of that, not only were they saying, well, look, McRaney was a bad leader, which maybe you would expect in any old Baptist battle, but they were saying things like McRaney didn't show up at meetings or McRaney didn't ask for approval. But McRaney says, I've got proof I was at all the meetings. I've got proof I asked for all the approvals. That's just plain old defamation, right? If you called up, if McDonald's called up Wendy's and said, that guy never turned in his time cards, but the guy had all the time cards, you say, well, that's just defamation. You're just trying to make it hard for that guy to get a job by telling old-fashioned lies. That's not a Baptist doctrinal dispute the courts can't consider. So McRaney brings suit in, I believe he's in Alabama, where he lives.
Lived.
Yeah, where he lived. And so the courts there, initially the trial court said, it looks like mostly a Baptist battle to me. There's lots of issues of Baptist doctrine here. And so he dismisses the case. McRaney then appeals that to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal circuit right below the Supreme Court. There's three layers of courts: the trial court, the appeal court, and the Supreme Court. The Court of Appeals initially said, well, there might be some religious issues here. Of course, courts can't decide religious issues. But McRaney has said that there were secular defamations as well. And so we would normally apply what we call neutral principles of law, but that just means, hey, the law. We'd normally apply the law to that, not any kind of Baptist law. And so what McRaney has pled, he deserves to get discovery on. And then if he can prove his case, he would get to go to a jury as long as it didn't involve religious issues. So it goes back down to the trial court. Trial court didn't like the case already, had already got rid of it once. So the trial court again says, after discovery, well, it still looks like it's a bunch of religious disputes to me. And so he dismisses the case at the trial court on the second go around. And then it comes back up to the Fifth Circuit after discovery. And the Fifth Circuit says, we got the law wrong last time. Not only does it not matter if the SBC told secular defamations or not, we should have never reached that question because this area of dispute is a dispute about a ministry leader. And so if it involves dispute about who should lead a ministry, courts can't cover that at all, whether or not there's defamation involved, whether or not that's religious defamation or secular defamation. So the court establishes, in this case, a much broader rule about secular defamation than the Fifth Circuit had in the last opinion or that had been applicable elsewhere. So that's what gets us to today. And then obviously with the Fifth Circuit ruling, McRaney appeals to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is what we call a court of limited jurisdiction. They don't have to take every case. They just take cases they think have risen to the level that needs to be decided. And so I think, if you're a Supreme Court judge, justice looking at this case, you say, this is one circuit. Let's see how other circuits might rule on this matter. Let's see how this develops down below. Even if this is an error in the law, we'll take our patience in correcting this. Unfortunately for Baptists, that means we've got this very vague statement in McRaney, and we can see how that vague statement is going to be used, I think, in worse ways in cases like Preston Garner, which we talked about last week. So that's a nutshell of the McRaney case and how we got here.
Did the Fifth Circuit composition change between those first and second considerations of the McRaney case?
No, you draw different panels each time, so you do to get different judges. The judge that was that wrote the dissenting opinion the first time around, Judge Ho, was now in the majority on this case. So he lost 2-1 last time. He wins 2-1 this time. The courts have multiple judges, and so you just pick a random panel of 3, and that part changed.
And so this is interesting because this is something that's been, hotly debated in Southern Baptist life for many years now, with people falling on pretty predictable lines, except for maybe you, because you know what you're talking about more than the vast majority of these other people talk about. So, why is this not a win for religious liberty, right? Because in the article that you initially wrote a couple of weeks ago, you said, if the Supreme Court declines to hear it, many people will champion this as a win for religious liberty. And when the Supreme Court declined to hear it, that's exactly what many voices did, including NAMB's lawyer, Matt Martins, which we could do a whole podcast on Matt Martins, Daniel Darling, Bart Barber, the Baptist Review boys, everybody else, saying, oh, nothing to see here. I'm glad that we have closed the door. Now I'm just sort of making stuff up and paraphrasing. I'm not quoting anybody, but it's like we've closed the door on this perpetual gadfly of Southern Baptist cooperation. Will McRaney can now go home and shut up. And in fact, I even saw some people saying like, oh, how can we make Will McRaney pay us back? But just absurd stuff. Will McRaney is a great guy. He's a faithful pastor. And when you rewind the tape to essentially what started all of this, whether they're allowed to do it or not, every Southern Baptist of good character and standing, I think, should have some moral indignation at the idea of, let's assume McRaney is not just making up lies on a whole cloth. The idea that NAMB could essentially hold the Baptist State Convention hostage to remove somebody they didn't like. I mean, that's just not how we're supposed to be operating. And then to go even further and go around and defame the guy afterwards, after his removal, after he's got fired, to make sure that he can't get other jobs in Southern Baptist Convention life. If those things are true, regardless of the doctrines at hand, church autonomy and internal governance, I just don't think that's how Southern Baptists would want to comport themselves. And yet people are celebrating this. So why is it not as celebratory as some voices might be making it sound?
Yeah, I mean, I think the missing voice here really was the will of Southern Baptist churches as opposed to the interests of Southern Baptist leaders. Again, we've talked about incentives. And so I know many of the lawyers in this area, and I respect them, and I generally think they're trying to do the right thing as they see the Constitution. The problem I think that happened here was they told the leaders, hey, there are some rules that really protect the Catholics. Wouldn't that, in effect, wouldn't you like the same protection? And instead of thinking, hey, is this what Baptists want? Is this actually in the interest of Baptist churches? They said, no, that sounds good to me because any lawsuit against me is a bad lawsuit, right? I'm the good guy here. And so obviously any lawsuit against me is frivolous. I need to win any lawsuit, whatever rule you have that might get me out of that and proves Will McRaney should lose. That's the rule we want. And so there wasn't anybody at the table with the background in religious liberty law and the understanding of Baptist polity in those decision-making rooms to say, that's really not how we work. And I don't think the churches want a rule that says Southern Baptist bigwigs can defame them without any resort to the court, merely because you cooperate with the Southern Baptist Convention. I understand why the Catholics have their rule, and I'm happy for their First Amendment protection, but that's because they're different. They believe different. They want different things. And I think what probably would have been helpful was to frame this really as Baptists think about their parachurch cooperation. The Baptists believe the state convention is as separate from the SBC, is as separate from the local church as Episcopalians are from Methodists, are from Presbyterians. And it's not clear that in an agreement between separate churches, they want religious courts, right? Why would the Episcopalians want to be judged by Methodists or vice versa? But that really is kind of the rule, and so nobody was taking that position. And I think there was a consensus. Well, this is all Baptist stuff, right? It's all the Baptist family. So the Baptist house, the Baptist leaders get to decide what happens inside the Baptist house, and that's not what the Baptist churches want. We are vigorously protective of local church rights against self-imposed, self-proclaimed, self-anointed parachurch spiritual leadership. And so whether it just wasn't thought through, or whether it was entirely selfish, or whether it was, any port in a storm, whatever rule makes me win, I'm not entirely sure. But we end up with a result that I don't think Baptist churches want, because it's not all in the same Baptist family. We are protective of the ultimate authority of local churches over the people that agree to be bound as a congregation, and we reject any spiritual authority outside the local church amongst parachurch institutions. And this decision, in the way it's framed, really appears to respect Baptist leadership, give them special Baptist legal rights in a way that I think, ultimately infringes on the Establishment Clause. I think it's bad legal reasoning because the right people weren't at the table.
Okay, so let's try to put this in like real layman terms for our listeners, John. So like the outcome of this case, now that it stands, now that NAMB has won, means what? It seems like one of the things it could mean is that there's now a legal precedent that essentially argues that hierarchy does exist in the Southern Baptist Convention in a way that previously, up until this week in the year of our Lord 2026, Baptists would have vehemently denied exists within the Southern Baptist Convention. That now, instead of being independent, autonomous churches cooperating voluntarily with the Southern Baptist Convention, and even though this really wasn't about McRaney and his church per se, this was about McRaney as an employee of a Baptist state convention, but we would make those same arguments that these are independent, autonomous, state-level Baptist associations that the churches are cooperating with voluntarily, not ceding any authority to the state conventions when they cooperate. And in fact, you can cooperate with state conventions and not cooperate at the national level. At least we used to be able to until today, but it seems like this really collapses those. So try to break that down in terms of like, man, what does this mean for us as Baptists now? Are we even still Baptist after this?
Yeah, I think so. The rule of McRaney is that anytime there's a dispute between cooperating religious groups, whether they're autonomous or not, if there's any cooperation between those groups and there's a dispute about whether or not somebody is fit for ministry or should lead the ministry, or there's competing ideas about the ministry, the courts won't touch cases between those two groups. And the courts also won't make any decisions involving leadership of those groups or members of those groups. So cooperating churches means, under the rule of McRaney, that even if in other cases you could go to law and say that person defamed me or that person committed a tort against me, as long as somebody to that dispute can say, well, I just did that because I didn't want John Doe to be the leader of this Baptist group, the courts will then take their hands off and say, you can't get civil justice. Go find whatever church court will give you justice if you can find one. But the courts cannot, as a matter of constitutional law, get involved in any tort if the core of it involves a dispute about who should lead a Baptist ministry. And so that means whether or not you think you're in the Southern Baptist Convention, whether you've ever been to the Southern Baptist Convention, whether you signed up to do anything with the SBC, if you've never been to a meeting, if you've never didn't even know that your church was Southern Baptist, this is the case in some churches, if you didn't ever heard of the Southern Baptist Convention, but your church cooperates, the new rule is Southern Baptist leaders can defame members of that local church as long as they did so to make sure the right guy was in the job somewhere. And while we've always lived with the rule, well, if it's a Baptist dispute, if it's a really religious dispute, that's one thing. but now they can lie about your time cards. Now they can lie about your meetings. And so the question is not so much, I think the problem there is people who never signed up for this problem are now going to find out that if there's some scoundrel out there that wants to lie about them, the courts have said hands off. And the only reason they can't get justice is because they're cooperating with the local church in a way they never anticipated would result in some spiritual court or some extra church court or some outside authority being able to take away their rights to the courts. And so massive implications for what it means to be a Southern Baptist in the pews and your legal rights. If some scoundrel somewhere can say, well, I was mad that somebody had the wrong job. That really leads to some bad incentives. We've talked about incentives and how those get misused. And so I have no reason to believe that there are sinless people at the top of SBC institutions. The sin is at the top and the bottom. And I don't want to see rules that disadvantage average Southern Baptists at the expense of their leaders. That's establishment. That's what Baptists have always fought against. And it's particularly disappointing to see it that result here in McRaney.
Yeah, I mean, I think in real, like, kind of layman terms for me, it's like I would never have thought that joining the Southern Baptist Convention or cooperating with the Southern Baptist Convention means that I'm essentially signing away my rights under the rest of the American legal system about things that are not pertaining to matters of doctrine within the Southern Baptist Convention life. That when I join a Southern Baptist Convention church that cooperates with, the South Carolina Baptist Convention and cooperates with the Southern Baptist Convention, that I am now saying that, you know what, it's okay if they want to lie about me or defame me in a secular way. I'm signing up for that. I don't think anyone thinks they're signing up for that. Except now they are.
and I think the response from folks that are happy about McRaney would say, well, it's not a question of who decides or whether it can be decided. It's just a question of who decides. And so you just have to go to a church court and get that resolved, some kind of Baptist court. Baptists don't really want to set up extra.
We don't have those, John.
Well, for good reason. We don't want to set up para-church spiritual courts. That would be equally as offensive as anything else. But I think given the way the rule of McRaney is framed, it's not clear you could force a decision, even if you went to the church court. If you said, I'm taking it to my local church and I'm going to prove that NAMB lied about me. Well, your church could award you $1 million. The court's not going to make NAMB participate, and the court's not going to make NAMB pay that money. So really, you don't have a inside the church way to obtain justice if the other party doesn't want you to obtain justice. And so despite all the talk about, well, this just means that churches can decide and not courts, I think the way the rule is framed, actually you can't. You won't be able to get justice even from the church courts, and your only out is to stuff it. You stuff it and no longer do business with them, but that might leave you injured. That might leave you with serious problems that every other person in America could obtain compensation for through the civil justice system. So you're denied civil justice solely because there's some Baptist leader out there that says this was a leadership dispute. I just don't think that could be a good First Amendment rule.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like it, and yet that's what people are celebrating. Okay, so let's go through the NAMB FAQ and just have you pick it apart here, right? So, I mean, you've given the general setting here. So you can find this online. You can find it on their X account with their locked comments. And so this is their statement from February 23rd. What happened at the Supreme Court? Supreme Court declined to review a lower court's ruling in NAMB's favor. Years-long legal dispute filed against our ministry. The Supreme Court's denial, as it is called, brings the litigation to a close. We know all that. Okay, so what did the Fifth Court Circuit decide? The Fifth Court Circuit held that the First Amendment's church autonomy doctrine barred the claims in this case because resolving them would require civil courts to intrude into matters of faith, doctrine, and internal religious decision-making. Importantly, the court recognized the autonomy and non-hierarchical structure of Baptist churches and ministries, the voluntary cooperation among Baptists in pursuit of a shared mission. Okay, essentially, though, John, you're saying like it does the total opposite of that.
Yeah. The problem is it doesn't so much respect the autonomy of individual Baptists. It respects the assertions of Baptist leaders of power over them. And so nobody before the fact signed an agreement to let NAMB decide anything. Nobody before the fact agreed to let Southern Baptist ministers or leaders lie about them. But the end result of the McRaney decision is the person injured that never agreed to this setup, they're deprived of civil justice. And so for lots of theological and political theory reasons, right? The Baptists don't have Baptist courts outside local churches because that's anathema to us. But the leaders managed to convince the court, well, they can get justice inside the Baptist church. Baloney. No one is going to subject the SBC entities to local church discipline decisions. They don't intend to do that. And so it just means you have to stuff it. When the leaders say it's a matter of leadership dispute, then it doesn't matter where the harm falls. You have to stuff it. And as a constitutional matter, you can't get justice. That's a surprising new principle that I think has lots of harmful downstream effects.
But, so again, just as like a non-legal, mind reviewing this. Now, I'm not a lawyer. How was it that they were not able to, the Fifth Circuit Court was not able to differentiate between the substance of McRaney's claim here being not a matter of faith or doctrine or actually internal religious decision-making? So NAMB's trying to claim that this is great, that the lawsuit is over because it bars them from, would require civil courts to intrude into matters of faith, doctrine, and internal religious decision-making. But McRaney is saying they didn't fire me over me not having Baptist beliefs. In fact, arguably, McRaney has much more Baptist beliefs than the NAMB people who wanted him out. But they fired him because he wasn't cooperating with NAMB exactly how they wanted their state convention leaders to be cooperating with the national entity. And then also they defamed him, said wrong things about his character and conduct. Those are two words that I think are helpful for me, at least. They said they made false statements, not about McRaney's religious convictions, but rather about his character and his conduct. Why was the court unable to differentiate between those two materially different buckets here?
One, because Baptist leaders told them that if the court did that, they couldn't survive, right? They would lose this suit if the court didn't do that. Logically, I think the first thing the court came to, it was the argument, well, Judge, the Catholics can do this, but the Baptists can't. And so you need to make a ruling that harmonizes the outcome in Catholic and Baptist cases so that everything in the Catholic family that happens, the courts would treat the same as if it happens in the Baptist family. And as I've said, that's not how Baptists think of themselves. The court needed to think of this as ecumenical cooperation, not all inside the same family of faith. So that was one error. And then second, the idea that the constitutional doctrine really needs to make sure the Baptists always come out like the Catholics, that there was some emotional resistance. Well, that's religious discrimination between the denominations. And that does happen at points, but that really wasn't the implication here. But frankly, logically, that's how they got there, was deciding, well, first this has to come out like the Catholics, and the Baptists and Catholics have to come out the same way. And then it was just a matter of kind of cleaning up the loose ends. McRaney said, I can prove it was secular defamation. And the court said, well, one of his witnesses said they did think less of him, but part of that was because of the way he had handled himself with NAMB. And so that in itself was a religious question. That's not really how you deal with the proof of evidence. The question should have been, can McRaney prove his claims without religious evidence? And can he prove damages without religious evidence? And if there's any chance he can, he deserved a trial. The court said, he probably can't prove it without religious evidence, and so kind of made the little leap there to tie up the loose end and dispose of the claim. But the oomph behind the logic was, we got to make sure the Baptists and the Catholics come out together. And as a Baptist, I don't think, frankly, the Catholics want that, and I don't think anybody else wants that. But that's what Baptist leaders stood up and told the courts they wanted, and so the court assumed they knew what they were talking about and gave them what they asked for.
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission's, it was an amicus brief, right, that they filed on behalf of NAMB that was so wrong-footed, they had to come back and apologize and clarify that actually we as the Southern Baptist Convention's official public policy and advocacy arm are not saying there is no difference between Baptists and Catholics.
Right. Which again shows the problem of the way NAMB described itself repeatedly to other groups, to other Christians, about how it's the SBC mission board, or it's McRaney was in an SBC church or an SBC state convention, which isn't how we think of those things. But there was such pressure to say, well, we work just like the Catholics, that ERLC at one point, they used a charitable law firm, a group of religious liberty lawyers. I think they were Catholic background. And so they wrote a brief up that described how they thought the SBC must work, given all these arguments that were being made. And the argument they made was, well, the SBC is just like the Catholic Church. It's a hierarchy. This is national, and national is always over state, and state is always over local. And so it just makes sense. This is all inside the Baptist family. And the RLC apparently didn't look at that argument closely, and it was made to the court in the first go around that McRaney ultimately won. And then when some people actually read the brief, they said, this is the total opposite of Baptist polity. This is the area in which Baptists and Catholics are polar opposites. The Catholic Church is hierarchical. The Baptist churches are not. State is not over local. National is not over state. They're totally independent. It's just like the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians were in a fight. It's not like all in the same family like over in the Catholic Church. But obviously, the Catholic lawyers writing the brief for RLC thought they were doing a faithful job of describing what their client had told them about Baptist polity, whether they told them enough or not. And the impression they had was it was hierarchical. And I think there were lots of Baptist leaders that should have known better, that the RLC had to correct their misimpressions. I think other folks were content to let the court think this was all the same family and not point out that difference.
Right. And so the NAMB statement, I pulled it off the screen, but you can find it. I mean, they it seems like they really are. It's like, opposite day, because then in their next point, they say that this underscores how we are non-hierarchical. So, I mean, do they really not understand? Or are they just spinning? Like what, like they're essentially, when you read the NAMB statement, they're essentially saying everything you're saying, John, but saying that it's not happening. It's like, it'd be like all of John's concerns we agree with. And in fact, this case protects all of Jon Whitehead's concerns here, but it's the total opposite.
Yeah. I told somebody that, they protected church autonomy in the way that when Henry Ford promised you could have a car of any color, your autonomy to select a car of any color as long as it was black. And that's the way this decision came out, was you could be an autonomous church any way you want as long as you submit to SBC leaders. And I think a serious question, and not one I'm happy to have to grapple with, is that even if Baptists wrote out explicitly, we don't want any of this nonsense. We want to be, we judge, if we defame each other in secular ways, you apply the law and make it fair. We trust the courts to do justice here. If you chose that under McRaney, I'm not sure you can even get that. I'm not sure that if you wanted the courts to enforce a Baptist agreement in the way that Baptists expect, and you wrote it out plainly, I think McRaney judicially imposes limits now that it's not clear to me that both parties can rely on the agreement being enforceable. And so if someone goes rogue and decides, I've got the money now and possession is 9/10 of the law, and they leave and don't honor the agreement, I'm not sure that courts won't, in the Fifth Circuit, say, McRaney ties our hands, we can't even hear that case. And that's just not what Baptists expected. So, yeah, I mean, it's a little flip, but to say, I'm not sure you can even have a Baptist agreement in the Fifth Circuit right now, that's where we are. There needs to be some clarity in this doctrine. So I'm hopeful the Garner case starts providing some ways to distinguish that.
Well, yeah, and I want to ask about the Garner case, but let me read a little bit of a summary here from our friend David Morrill, who's been tracking this pretty closely and has a decent article out. And I trust we have some excellent articles coming from Jon Whitehead on this. But he says, the tragedy of McRaney is not merely that one brother lost his case. It is that Baptist polity itself was implicitly redefined in federal court, and denominational leaders are celebrating the outcome. NAMB won dismissal, but the price may be a generation of pastors quietly reconsidering whether denominational partnership is worth the legal uncertainty it now carries. And if cooperation begins to erode because churches no longer feel legally safe partnering with the institution, they feel legally safe participating, the institution most threatened will not be a mission board. It will be the Cooperative Program and eventually the SBC itself. Is that a fair summary from David?
Yep, I think so. I think there is now a judicially imposed rule about how to interpret these agreements. And now the side that breaks them gets to say they're defending the religious liberty in the Fifth Circuit. I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah. And just maybe just like one last time, why does this actually not do anything positive for religious liberty, right? So I'd say a lot of sort of just your average listener, when they hear things like religious liberty, they think things like the right to meet on Sundays, the right for us as conservative Bible believing Christians to say that we reject the idea of so-called same-sex marriage, the right for us to live and operate according to our faith, our sincerely held faith and our conscience, not just in our churches, but in the public square. The right for Southern Baptists as an organization to say we won't let, gay ministers be pastors in SBC or things like that. Those are the things people think of when we talk about like religious liberty. And so, this isn't really bear on those things, but the religious liberty just seems to be a smokescreen. So just again, try to like when Southern Baptists see our former president, Bart Barber, see the NAMB lawyer, Matt Martins, see former ERLC employee, Dan Darling saying this is a win for religious liberty, it's sort of irrelevant to religious liberty because why?
Yeah, because you've taken away the religious autonomy of local churches and Baptists in their churches. The cost of giving increased protection to leaders was to take it away from the average Southern Baptist church, from the average Baptist in the pew, who didn't sign up. Nobody ever thought going down the aisle and professing the Baptist faith and messages, your confession of faith, would then give NAMB the right to defame you, and you can't go to the court. You have relied on the courts to impose a duty of honesty on everybody. When you deal with other Baptists face to face, you would expect that if they turn out to be a sinner and defame you, you'll be able to get civil justice. Nobody ever expected that by going forward in a Baptist church and joining, you'd be giving up your civil rights. And yet that's what's happened. The court has said, when you cooperate with the Baptists, you give up your civil rights to go to the court, and you have to go to some church court because we assume that's there. And it isn't there in Baptist life. You are told to lump it. You can't get compensation against defamations from people remote to you, even though with everybody else you can. It takes away the rights of Baptists in local churches to define themselves and replaces the definitions that leaders have imposed on them that benefit leaders and not individuals. So do I support church autonomy? Yes. Do I support religious liberty? Absolutely. But that is the liberty of every Christian to engage in free exercise, to define their own relationships, to enter a church that believes like they believe, not to give up your civil rights to some leader you've never heard of at an entity you've never heard of in a convention you barely knew you joined.
Right. And so really, it's not that religious liberty was under threat or attack by the fact that McRaney pursued this lawsuit. Religious liberty was never on the chopping block here. Instead, you're using the phrase civil rights. If I was trying to sort of, be Baptist and alliterative, I might say civil liberties, right? So it's like, we, instead of winning on religious liberty for Southern Baptists, which wasn't under attack, we've lost the civil liberties of Southern Baptists to use the judicial system in America to seek justice. I mean, that's really what's at stake here, is to seek justice when you have been materially wronged and harmed, and provably so, by people telling lies about you. Now your remedy has been taken off the table.
Yeah, and in essence, the Baptists are if they want justice, the Baptists will have to form a church court they don't want, right?
Because and we've never had.
and they never had it. They don't want it theologically. But now in order to get justice from NAMB, unless you subject NAMB to the individual decisions of any cooperating church, which NAMB will fight vigorously. They don't want to be subject to any church that finds them guilty in a church discipline proceeding. Now the Baptists have to set up some kind of church court that gives that court spiritual authority over the actions of other churches and their members. So it's not comedy between churches. It requires the erection of ecclesiastical courts that Baptists have rejected on theological grounds for eons. And now, because of this unclear ruling, we're going to face those issues anew, and at the risk of making some mistakes along the way.
Yeah, and it is interesting, maybe for our last little touch point in this conversation, is how this does or doesn't interact with the 5-7 years of conversation about resolving claims of abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention. Because I will also note to our listeners that we have won a lot on stopping the executive committee and the Southern Baptist Convention from doing foolish legal things to try to resolve the so-called abuse crisis, right? And of course, the loudest advocates continue to complain about that, but we stopped the formation of this, extra SBC nonprofit that was going to be set up outside of the jurisdiction of the messengers. That was the Josh Wester. I'm forgetting why I'm blanking. Wester idea. We have, the idea of having some sort of abuse hotline has not really come to fruition. But it is, it's like we were wanting to try to set up these sort of ecclesiastical courts to rule on claims of abuse, which we don't have the money to do, as you said. But even that, we don't have the ability to do it. And instead, now we're saying it just seems a little contradictory, right? We kind of tried to pursue this as setting up these courts for the abuse thing. It's never really worked. We've decided rightly we can't do it. Now I have this ruling essentially saying we're Catholics under the eyes of, the Fifth Circuit, and maybe we do need to set these courts up, which are never going to be set up. So how does this all play into the Garner case? My concern would be, as the Garner case is being decided, they see the Supreme Court, decide not to hear this. They look at the Fifth Circuit decision and they tell Garner, you have to stuff it too.
Yeah. Well, we talked last week a little bit about fear of God versus fear of man. Mm-hmm. And so the question, I think, for Southern Baptist churches is, do you trust that if given the right to do it, that no Southern Baptist leader would ever shade the truth or lie about local churches in order to make themselves look good in sex abuse defense claims? And the answer is, I don't believe that. I think we've seen shading of the truth even in what we've known about. And so we do not want, as Baptist local churches, a system that gives leaders an opportunity to, in essence, appeal to outside advocates and say, hey, we're as woke as you are. We said the right things, if that means shading the truth and throwing someone under the bus. I don't want that system in the SBC. And I think if you take the rules off of civil justice for folks that said, I didn't agree for you to defame me, we're going to end up with a system that is kind of a reckless defamation machine of local churches, so that certain leaders can look good. Certain leaders can appear at the right conferences they want to appear at, and they're not going to be quite as concerned that the pastor at First Baptist Pretty Prairie was collateral damage. I think true religious liberty cares about that pastor. I think true religious liberty cares about the rights of that church as much as it cares about the rights of any leader to investigate sex abuse claims. And so we're all going to have to live under the same rules, leaders and followers. That's what I'm arguing for. And I just think McRaney doesn't do that well.
Yeah, it is sad. It's disappointing. I mean, really, when you put it in sort of the context of everything else we've talked about, it just seems like everywhere we look in the Southern Baptist Convention, our leaders are doing anything and everything except defending what it means to be Baptist. Before the courts, we're telling them that treat us like Catholics. At Send, with the national Mobilizer and preaching and consulting ministries that are going to extend beyond the Southern Baptist Convention, we're becoming the generic evangelical denomination.
Yeah.
It's like,
And-
what does it mean to be Baptist anymore?
And as I told my friends at the ERLC several times, right? When you keep feeding good people into the system, but the incentives allow them to do it this way easier versus the hard way, you're going to find folks that choose what they think is the easier way. And so it's important that Baptist trustees and even courts reviewing what Baptists do, the Baptists have to hold the line and say, no, just because it's easier doesn't mean we're going to let you do it that way. We love you. We respect you. We love your ministry. But there are some hard rules about doing it the hard way. And so we're going to do the work because it is work. It's not kingdom vacation. It's kingdom work. There has to be hard work done. And just because it's easier doesn't mean that's the kind of growth we want. That's what we always have to be on watch for, because if any of us are given the job where we can only be successful by doing it the easy way and not the right way, that's just human nature. It's not fair to put people in that spot. Baptists need to hold the line on those issues.
Yeah. And if you want to help hold the line on those issues, you need a plan to come to Orlando, and you need a plan to do it now. Let me just make a remark on travel costs. Individuals who may not be thinking through this, as somebody who travels quite a bit, don't wait until May to book your flights to Orlando. Like book them now. And also, Orlando is really important, not just, for trying to elect somebody who has a vision for actual Baptistic reform in SBC, someone like Willie Rice, but because if you look at the out years over the next 10 years of our Southern Baptist Convention annual meetings, not a lot of them are in the South. Some of them are. We'll be in Houston. We'll be in San Antonio. We're going back to Indianapolis. That's certainly not the South. We're going to go to Anaheim a couple of times. The bottom line is we're not going to really be in Southern Baptist territory in many of the out years. So Orlando is particularly important because the leadership changes begin with the election of a right president. And just for maybe anybody listening who's made it this far, who feels discouraged about the state of the SBC, I really just want to tell you, we kind of haven't really even begun to fight in the last 10 years or so, because we haven't had the right guy in making the right appointments that trickle down. John and I were talking, earlier last week about, who are the conservative, Baptist minded, reformed minded brothers on the executive committee who share our concerns about the way the convention is unfolding, about the differences between what happens in Nashville and what happens in the local church. And we're having a hard time coming up with anybody that's really concerned about these things. And so we need multiple years of multiple reform, small r, reform-minded Baptists leading our convention to get the right people into these spots to turn these things around. Because if, say, you don't think we should have a so-called national mobilizer at Send, the only way that changes is by getting different trustees at NAMB. Send doesn't have trustees. NAMB has trustees. NAMB trustees are downstream of the presidents that we pick. And so if you want to change any of this beyond just throwing up your hands in frustration, designating your giving, or walking away and ceding this massive operation for the gospel to people who don't want to steward it in the way that Baptists intended for it to be stewarded, you have to come to Orlando. John, any comments on that?
Yeah, this year will be the easiest year in 10 years to go. If you're listening to this and you care about these issues, for most of you, this will be the easiest convention for you to go to for the next 10 years. And it's also the most important. So, make your reservations, make the effort. If you're ever going to make the effort, this is the year to do it. And we hope to see you there.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, John. If you have made it this far to the end, we just wanted to let you know that we appreciate your support. We appreciate the people who take the time to listen to this and those who care about the future of the Southern Baptist Convention, not the General Evangelical Convention, not the Southern Pseudo-Catholic Convention, but the Southern Baptist Convention. And we are here to help lead efforts to bring us back to biblical fidelity and Baptistic roots. And we can't do that without your support. So if you or your church have been considering supporting the Center for Baptist Leadership, now would be a great time to do so, as we are looking forward to going full steam ahead over the next few months, preparing for Orlando, hopefully hosting another great event there in Orlando. We trust that there will be a lot of people there, but we need your support to help keep us going now and through Orlando to bring about these needed changes. You can give a gift, a tax-deductible donation online at centerforbaptistleadership.org. Jon, thanks so much for joining us again for this conversation. Appreciate the time you're putting into this.
Good to be here.
All right, folks, we'll see you next week.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.